Good afternoon, everyone. Gosh. My name is Thomas. My name is Thomas Berlanda, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you today. There's a horrible echo, but hopefully it will settle. And so I want to welcome you all to this event, which is part of the Mind the Gap lecture series, but it's also the last event, which is part of the visiting professorship I was invited to host in the Turin Polytechnic, thanks to the chair of Camillo Boano and DIST. And as part of this professorship, we organized a PhD seminar titled Ungrounding, Experimenting Methodological Entanglements from the Global South. And together with our students, we decided to invite Sumayya Vally, which I'm really delighted to see online today from London, speaking to us in what hopefully will be, a wide-ranging conversation on notions of research and practice, pedagogy and performance, art and architecture, under the idea of minding the gap between different modes of architectural practice and research. I will give just a few info on the structure of the next hour and a half. I'm mindful of the fact that Sumayya will need to leave at 1:30 sharp. I will give a brief introduction to Sumayya, followed by 3 videos, which will be played. There's obviously a fascinating game going on in Zoom for those of you who are following. And then after the videos, we'll moderate a conversation which will be led by both students in the PhD seminar and master students around the themes that are proposed. So shortly, for those of you who do not know Sumayya Vally and her practice Counterspace, which she was one of the co-founders of and is currently principal, she's a South African architect, graduated from the School of Architecture at WITS in 2015, before joining the Graduate School of Architecture in Johannesburg as a unit tutor and later unit leader of Unit 12. And most recently, she was the youngest ever architect to be commissioned the Serpentine Pavilion in London, originally scheduled for 2020 and then due to COVID moved to 2021. Incidentally, she's only the second African architect to be commissioned the pavilion. And you will all know that the first African architect who was commissioned the pavilion just 2 days ago was awarded a Pritzker Prize, Francis Carey. She practices through design research, publishing, pedagogy, built interventions, speculative thoughts, and has been exhibited at a number of exhibitions, from the first international platform, which was for the 2015 Chicago Architecture Biennale, till today, where she's currently working on curating an exhibition for a Biennale in the Emirates. She's been listed as one of Time's 100 Next List honoree and a number of other prizes and accolades. So, but without me taking a lot of time over from Sumayya's work, I will let 3 videos being played that introduce snippets of her activity and her collaborative practice before then trying to moderate a conversation. Thanks again, Sumayya, for accepting the invitation. I'm really sorry that this is not happening in person, but it's a pleasure to see you again online. And so I hope we can just play the videos and then take it from there.
We need to ask ourselves if the world around us is being made in our image, and if it isn't, whose image is it being made of, and how do we start to make our own? when people are excluded or when stories are erased, it's a ravage of culture, a whole generation of thought that could have evolved out of that. My biggest inspiration is Joburg for all of its energy, all of its challenges, and all of its opportunities. The softness that there is in the quality of light, which I think is something really special about the city. I spent big amounts of my childhood in my grandfather's store in inner city Joburg. And I vividly remember walking the streets of Joburg as a child and really being in love with it from a very young age. It is a place of so many other places, movements, cultures, and different forces. People have found ways to make the city home. I think it's a testament to how resilient people are. When we were invited to make a submission for the pavilion, I really wanted to reflect what someone like me from our context and from our part of the world could bring to this pavilion. And I think that's something that Joburg has given me, or something that I strive for in my work, is always trying to read beneath the surface. And I really wanted to reflect a London that is plural and that is about many different places, that honors voices from many different times, past, present, and future. The role of an architect is to be able to absorb, reflect, and translate who we are into the world. We need to be able to listen deeply to these silences and whispers. There's a whole set of worlds that are waiting to happen inside of them. I often think about our identities and how different the world looks from different perspectives. Our architecture is slanted in a very particular worldview that is very limited. And so I think that understanding how our different ways of being manifest differently visually, and then starting to explore what that can mean for architecture. My ambitions around building are very much about reimagining structures so that they reflect who we are. And we need to do that now. I'm Sumayya Vally, and I'm the architect of the 20th Serpentine Pavilion. Counterspace is a design research practice based in Johannesburg, and we're focused on finding design form and design expression, which brings together a multitude of voices from across the African continent and beyond. The idea for the pavilion originally came about because I was really interested in being able to express stories of place and stories of migration across London. London is a place of extreme hybridity. Everyone is kind of an insider and an outsider. We all embody that condition in different ways. I spent a lot of time when I first came to London at the Bishopsgate Library and Archive, and I worked through their pamphlet collection. I looked at events that were taking place around waves of migration that occurred in the city. The most important part about this pavilion for me is that it's conceived in 5 parts. There is the structure that we're sitting in now in Kensington Gardens, but then there are 4 other structures that are embedded in the city across London. There is a stage set at the Tabernacle in Notting Hill, the headquarters for the Notting Hill Carnival. There's a fragment at New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park, a bookstore that was one of the first in the UK with a focus on Afro-Caribbean and African diasporic literature. There is a seat at the Albany in Deptford, and then there is a fragment at the Valence House Library in Barking and Dagenham, and that will form part of a hub that's going to be a radio station. These spaces are also really important in how they function for communities, that people take care of each other's children, that women come together. Within all of these structures of gathering, there are moments of intimacy and exchange, there are moments for one-to-one conversation, but also the pavilion comes together to form a set of larger gatherings. I hope that when people come to this pavilion, that they'll feel the spirit of generosity that's embodied in so many of these places. As a response to COVID, I was struck by the generosity of bodies who actively hold these spaces. And so Support Structures for Support Structures was born to support up to 10 artists a year working at the intersection of art and ecology, art and social justice, and art and the archive, through funding, but also through mentorship and skills support. It really feels like a triumph to know that this pavilion has become a shared platform for so many voices to come together, and this pavilion is very much about embedding itself in London and about being able to fold London into the pavilion and the pavilion back out into London. And that was something that was at the heart of the intent of this pavilion from the very beginning.
Thank you. Sumayya, I wonder if you want to add a few words before we start a conversation.
Maybe just to say first, thank you so much, Tuma. It's such an honor to be here with you, especially that it's the close of your seminar series and of this workshop that you're doing. I don't underestimate the value and the knowledge that I've shared through you, and I think it feels like a really special moment that we're having this conversation now, and I'm really grateful to be in the presence of this class and all these students. It may be just a reflection on why those three films in particular. I think I really was thinking about this relationship between territories and about being able to reflect resonance across territories, which is something that I'm thinking about at the moment, being presently based between Johannesburg and London more recently. So maybe I'll just stop there and we can have more of a conversation about it.
Thank you. The way we have tried to give a structure to what follows is that we're going to have a number of students on stage leading really the questions, with me trying to moderate if at all necessary, which I don't think so. And so then we can let it grow organically. So I don't know who wants to start.
I can start with a question. Thank you, Sumayya, for being here. It's really a pleasure to meet you. I have a question talking about the last reflection you were sharing. Considering the intentional shared authorship of Counterspace and also how this has changed in the last years, I was wondering on two directions. The first is kind of this importance of not stating the authorship in a collective and how you deal with this in your practice. And then the second is considering the importance of listening and learning to listen to the silences and the absence and the unheard, how you deal with those voices in the authorship of your architectural practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great and I think very complex question. And perhaps something about the way the question is framed is also hinted at in the second part of the question, about the recognition of unrecognized voices. I think that working collectively is always complex because of the way that dynamics evolve and the ways in which different bodies of knowledge grow in different directions. I think from the beginning, and I think even presently, actually, the way that the last pavilion is credited, even though perhaps I have been the person leading the idea and so on, it's credited to Counterspace because of a collective energy around the practice and around ways of working. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that part of the strength of collaborative models of working is the ability to find strength in collaboration, but also in to let those collaborations be agile and be evolving. And the structure of Counterspace, as you said, has evolved over time, many times over the years. When it started, it was founded with 5 of us who shared a studio together in our master's year at Wits University. And it subsequently evolved many times, and it's been a place of varied forms of, I'd say, agency and ownership, full-time, part-time, partly academic and otherwise. And I think where it's at now really has, I hope really is that it's framed as a place that is about collective work, but I'm trying to work through it so that it is a place that allows for this agility and flexibility. Because I found in the past that often in collaborative frameworks, as soon as we try to pin things down into a very strict long-term structure, it starts to lose all of the strength that the collaboration of being agile brings. And so at the moment, it's reflected through Counterparts, which was founded by Sarah de Villiers and myself during COVID. It's a little bit on hold since the way the pandemic has shifted and moved our practice spaces. But the intention was really for it to be a shared platform for collaborative works where different design thinkers, researchers, writers can come together, share physical space and virtual space, but also be able to publish together periodically and work on projects. And it's something, I think collective work is something that I'm deeply committed to, but continuously having to work on and interrogate and investigate. I think there's also, as you said, a kind of dichotomy or difficulty in being unnamed in a collective, in calling something a collective name, but then also at the same time, the practice is working with, as you said, sometimes bringing out histories and working through research that wants to manifest and find form and representation. Perhaps I think maybe we can think of, if we think of forms of authorship and ownership in other bodies of knowledge, and for example, on something I'm working on at the moment, there are forms of collective making and ways of making things that are less focused on individual credit and authorship and more focused on the idea of the collective structure and how everyone is honored through the physical making of a thing. So I wonder, I know that feels a little bit abstract, but I wonder if in the design and the making of something itself, we also think about how we structure processes so that different bodies are allowed to participate or encouraged to take ownership of different parts and so on. And I think to also let that be and evolve is something that's very important. For example, the program that I worked on initiating with the Serpentine called Support Structures for Support Structures is, I think, evolved into an entity in and of itself. And Amal Khalaf at the Serpentine is now working through and leading on the project really. And I think it's now shifted into being something else. So there's also an understanding of ourselves almost in ancestral terms, in a lineage of working on something and then passing it on for others to work through and work on. And architecture is very much the same. It's ownership and authorship doesn't stop with the people who are the architect of bringing it into being, but it also should continue on with collective ownership in how it's used and continued.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answer and thank you for being here. Saskia, who talked before, and we are both PhD students at Polytechnic University of Turin. And we are, since we are students of architecture, but some of us also already practice architecture professionally. I was wondering, like, what is how you define your architectural practice, since it carried out like different disciplines, and this is also the main topic of our cycle of conferences. So how you weave art, research, reading, and writing together, and how you then define your work as the all these disciplines that are bringing together their contribution, and what is the output is it's architecture or it's something more? Thank you.
I think for me, the output is always architecture, and I'm always insistent on defining my practice as an architecture practice. The different forms of space making, world making, whatever we call them, that range from the thinking through and design of atmospheres, the research practice, the focus on different media, whether those are oral, choreographed, or film. My artistic and curatorial practice also, I really see those as very valid forms of practicing architecture. And I think that there's something about being a young practitioner on the continent, in South Africa in particular, in the global South more broadly perhaps, where I feel really inspired by different forms of space making. And I believe that there are so many conditions in my context that are way ahead of where architecture is at. And our profession broadly has become quite static and quite, I think it's in a way, it's ceased to evolve with how quickly conditions in our context are evolving. And that's also partly to do with the fact that much of our profession, and by this I mean the parts of our work that are very professionalized and that we train for at university and then graduate and join professional bodies and then practice the discipline of architecture. Much of this is inherited and is in fact at odds with ways of being in our context, which are much more deeply rich and textured, which think through space making in many, many different forms, whether those are forms of dress or ways of making atmospheres, celebration and festival, ritual and ephemeral practice. All of those are center stage in ways of honoring and practicing space making. And I'm not saying that we should stop there and we should romanticize that too much and also not be able to learn from it. But I think in working through learning from these conditions, which I see as research, curatorial, writing practice, there's also the will and the desire to translate them into form. And that is the process of making architecture. So I always am quite insistent, in fact, in defining myself as an architect and in claiming all of these other disciplines into the architectural realm, because I think that in a South African context, in an African context, in this Southern condition, those are all very valid forms of space making. And in fact, they will, and they are pushing the discipline forward. And we need to be able to reckon with them more fully.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your answer. And I really appreciated it because my question will go forward of this question, because I was questioning myself that I think that one of the great challenges that we as architect of the next generation have to find, it's that maybe we have to to find an universal language for describe like an urban situation, but also a language that it's specific on the side and that can manifest like the base culture of the place. And like going back and linking to the first video that we look, you also said that your big inspiration was Johannesburg, and how the people make Johannesburg their home when they like move in a city that was already built from another culture. And I want to ask, which is your inspiration in your practice, what you bring about this in your practice, and also if you have some suggestion for our challenges that we have to support, which can be the element when where we can start to looking for. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to understand what you mean by universal language.
Like going for like in a, I think that we are based in a like globalized world, so we have to find like an universal language to communicate and to have like some economic and commercial exchange, but also moving in a different context and a different cultural context. So this is what I mean about based on a specific side.
So do you mean like one kind of universal language?
No, I think that we have to move from like based on an universal language that can be universal in a architectural form, in a morphologic form, but inside we have to find some specific situation and specific manifestation of about our culture to grow a sustainable, socially integrated environment where culture can be a manifestation, and I think that it's bring by the action of the people that live there and how the people live the space. And I find really interesting your video when in the first video and in your practice when you talk about like that people transform Johannesburg in their own home based on their action. So my question was, what you read and what you bring inside your practice about that?
Okay, thank you. I hope I understand. I'm not sure I believe in a universal language so much. I think I really do believe in dialogue with place and in working to absorb and then translate something about our relationship or our interaction with that place, whether that's through readings from past or from whatever that is, archaeological, historical, social readings of place, and how we work with those to be able to reflect them in place, and how that also has implications for our future interactions in that place. So I think for me, I'm really interested in specificities, but also perhaps where there is an element that maybe touches on universality is through a focus on hybridity, because I think that it's kind of, I don't know how to say, but I don't believe that any body necessarily has a monopoly on what a particular reading of a place or our relation to that place is. And I think that I believe so much in hybridity because it is able to navigate the complexities of place. And as you mentioned, the fabric of Johannesburg has been inherited, but even that fabric that's there and that's been inherited is a part of the place that has to be navigated and negotiated, and that is also a part of our fabric and of our lives. But there are also continual layers being added onto place through, as you mentioned, rituals of being in how people live their lives, ecological conditions, different atmospheric conditions. I'm really interested in the expression of place in all of those dimensions, and often think about things that are, or perhaps start as intangible, and how they can become architectural through the process of design, and I know that's not really revolutionary, because I think that all the architecture we have around us is a distillation and an abstraction of certain forms of politics and particular ways of being, but it's become so abstracted that we also don't recognize the starting points of those. And I think in order to be able to reckon with and manifest other ways of being, we need to look at different starting points. And so I'm interested in a multitude and plurality and as many different starting points as possible to be able to imagine the world differently through dialogue with all those different perspectives and starting points, whether they be ritual, whether they be economic, in the form of other kinds of economic systems that we find in Johannesburg, like forms of trade, the way that our transportation system works, but also things from a particular cultural lenses, like how people come together to save collectively. So lots of different forms of ritual, but then also different atmospheric conditions, different forms of celebration and forms of honoring. I'm interested in how all of those can find their way into becoming and being form. So there's not necessarily one formula for looking at something. And I think that's also why my work in general, or my portfolio of works, is so varied, and the language of works is so different. The media and the output is also different, because I'm really committed to thinking about as many different forms of representation as possible. In this, I think it's a kind of ongoing project to be able to imagine and find different languages, and find also ways of making process a very valid part of the architectural concern. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, for sure. Thank you for the answer. Really.
Good morning, Sumayya. Thank you for your answer. I think that my question today regards a little, like in some way, the language issue that you just mentioned, because it's about the dictionary on the Counterspace website, which to me was a useful tool through which I could excavate through your work. I think it resonated with me because in the seminar with my PhD peers, where we discussed our approach methods to the PhD work, several times we had the chance to mention the importance to foreground the terms that are at the base of a research, that in some way contextualize them in the optic of our expected outcomes and in the optic of the conversations that we want to create among the explored subjects. In this sense, the dictionary made sense to me as one of the ways to build an archive of the way in which you and Counterspace see the world. So my first question on this will be on the way this archive was started and how it came about, and if it was like a necessity that you had to just put all the objects and the projects in order, or if it was a goal from the beginning to have specific words being right for the projects and the work that you were doing.
Thank you so much. It's such an interesting question, and something that I am continuously also thinking through and kind of grappling with. I think I'm really interested in language, and in especially also thinking through the tools that other ways of defining things or other understandings have for making architecture. And this is an example that I use quite often, but for example, in many African or Eastern languages, the words for private and public translate differently to the ways that we use them in English. So words for public somehow translate more to things like communal or gathering, and private is somehow much more about intimacy or close connection. And I think that there are understandings for different spatial conditions that we can start to read if we think through other languages. And I think language is such an interesting way of thinking through how different worldviews are embodied. And if I think of, I don't know, I'm just trying to think, Gujarati or Urdu, there are so many really kind of fragrant ways of thinking through the language, and the terms are very flowery and kind of soft and gentle, and those also form, they give us an understanding of some of the cultural aspects of perhaps speakers of those language or those languages and territories around which they orbit. And I think that there's a lot of power in understanding what these different terms can give us. The lexicon came about, it's very, very incomplete, of course, and I also know that it needs a lot more work in terms of definitions and in terms of building it up. But it came about because of a struggle that I found to categorize the work. And I think there was, you know, in the way that I guess perhaps architectural practices define different projects, either through program, whether it's residential, cultural, commercial, or otherwise through scale, or otherwise through, which other ways do we define our projects? Whichever they are, I felt like there was something that didn't quite describe what I was exploring through the projects in these terms. And I wanted to be able to find other ways to think through the projects. And so the lexicon became a kind of like a filtering system with keywords that describe different aspects of the project. And as I said, I think it's a work in progress, but it's something that we're working on quite slowly and that hopefully will become a book project. Also must give a lot of credit here to my comms manager at Counterspace. Her name is Chantal Lou Alton, and she is instrumental in bringing about the lexicon and the dictionary. And she actually brought it about after kind of filtering several talks and things that I'd written. She started to draw on terms that I use or overuse. And then through that, we started this lexicon project.
Thank you. I think this work in progress state of the dictionary is probably the most interesting part. In fact, some of the questions that I had about that is the way in which words are changed by the projects, or the way in which you find yourself adapting projects to the words that you've already created for a lexicon. Meaning, how many times have you found yourself changing the definition of words because you started with an expectations for that definition, but that through practice, you saw it was different. It was maybe surprising to you in that sense. I'm not sure if the question was clear.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I'm finding it interesting. So at least for me, it feels clear. But there's something very interesting that you're describing, which is that architecture is a language in and of itself. And it's very interesting that through this abstraction, we allow meaning in and we also project meaning out. And absolutely, I think that as with the terms in the lexicon, I think architecture and projects are also in a way in progress and are catalysts for testing conditions or for reading situations, for bringing out aspects of context or history that need to be read more deeply or need to be perhaps brought to the surface or articulated in the same way that words allow us to do. And I know many architects talk about the relationship between narrative and form and of course, that's a different trajectory to, I think, what we're talking about here in this question. And what's interesting for me is that what you're describing is that architecture is also kind of in this continuum of exchange of meaning. And yeah, there's something really interesting that you're saying that I can't quite articulate, that is very much about process and about seeing the process of making architecture, the process of being convened by the act of design and being convened by the act of making buildings as we convene through building and in buildings, and being very abstract. But there's something about that process that is in itself, as it's being made, defining conditions or reflecting on conditions and situations. And it's a form of research, I think, as Tamar also has taught me and has reiterated through several of our conversations. The act of making something is also an act of open research.
I just have two last questions, if I may. One is why, but probably you've already answered partly to this, which is why there are words that are defined but don't have any projects for them. Are those any goals for the future of Counterspace? And then another one is regards the Serpentine Pavilion, which is, I was surprised when within the term colors, the Serpentine Pavilion wasn't among the projects. And to me, the opposition of black and pink tones in the pavilion are quite relevant of something. I mean, they give significance to the building with the other aspects. So I was wondering if that is something that was personal, or if it's not so, and if it is, then how.
So just the first question, okay, undefined words and the future. I think perhaps, yes, there is an intent in this idea of always being committed to the process of remaining emerging, remaining questioning, and remaining, thinking without having a predefined outcome or a closed process of reflection. And I think often websites are presented as portfolios of things that are already completed bodies of works. And I really wanted to be able to reflect this condition of a commitment to remaining emerging and thinking through. And I think even actually every project that's completed is continually shifting and changing because the condition around them are shifting and changing, and my reflections on them deepen, grow, and change in relation to what's happening around us. COVID is a really good example in terms of how it shifted meaning for the pavilion, even though the design itself didn't change too much. And by that I mean that the forms of collaboration started to become a lot deeper instead of perhaps being a little bit more symbolic, which they would have been with much less time. And I think the meaning that we all have around coming together and gathering, the rupture that we had around Black Lives Matter at the time, and the voices that many of the voices that the pavilion is working to amplify, also meant that some of these messages were heard more deeply. And that's I think, although the physical design didn't shift, the meaning constantly is shifting. And there's something about this unending, undefined space of terms and words that is perhaps, yes, thinking about things that are in process and unfinished, and continuing to be developed and reflected on. And then the other question about color, I think color is something that I would say is at the heart of my practice. And I know that sounds simplistic, but if I think of my master's project, it was a color factory that worked through all of these histories on the mine dumps in Johannesburg and worked on somehow having a physical deposit or a reflection of subconscious things that are happening inside the innards of the city and working to draw those out and visualizing them. I think color is also something that's very atmospheric, very spatial, very immersive, and it's definitely, I'd say, a very important design tool for me in how I think about the creation of atmosphere. It's also, I think, perhaps a response to a particular time in architectural history that was very much about being kind of sanitized. And I see all of these other ingredients, mythologies, magic, the interest in kitsch and camp, and a deep interest in color as a response and as a reaction to an insertion of magic or of attitude in that space. So I think color is something that maybe runs and ranges through all the projects, and I'm really excited that you picked up on it for the Serpentine Pavilion, because it's definitely something that gave me sleepless nights when I worked through thinking about the color palette and the gradient of colors. I also had to work on some part of that remotely. So I was looking at all of these shades of London in vast Johannesburg sun and thinking, like, really grappling with the difference in light condition through that process, which is interesting in and of itself. But I think, I mean, maybe it should be categorized under color, but there's also something about the interchangeability of all these terms and the relation between projects and terms that I think is continually shifting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Sumayya. Thank you very much to be here with us. And I want to continue the discussion, if you want, to Serpentine Pavilion about inclusiveness. I listened and I read one of your interview at the magazine The Talks, where you say that in each place people and communities must or should find a sense of representation. Actually, in the case of Serpentine Pavilion, I think that the problem is not only the representation of excluded communities, but also the creation of a space of inclusion for a rich class and minorities, in order to allow communication between the two different typologies of citizens. So my question for you is, how do you try to do this? The fragments around the city have this ambition, and do you think that the Serpentine Pavilion is today a place of inclusion and so of meetings, or is like a symbol of representation of excluded classes? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I certainly remained in London over the course of the summer because of the programming attached to the pavilion. And I worked very closely with the Serpentine Civic and Education team to be able to realize lots of different kinds of programs. Through the Parks Night program, we also had a program called Listening to the City, which invited London-based sound practitioners to work with, and who have a history of working in London neighborhoods, to work through the spaces and the themes reflected in the pavilion, and then provide something in collaboration with that. But we had an extensive program of events. Some of them I was involved in, most of them I was not involved in, and they were carried by the Serpentine Park Nights team and the Serpentine Civic and Education team. There were events with Jay Bernard, for example, is one where there was a game created in relation to economics in London and different forms of privilege that exist or different grades of privilege that exist on the same street. in different areas in London. So there were several programs, I think, created, inspired by the themes in the pavilion, that brought together different voices to the pavilion. I mean, I think it's something that one never knows when you do work, especially with archival research, and when one is working to listen deeply to voices that are even not present through archives and through the research and these silences and whispers that I mentioned. One never knows how that is going to resonate. And because a lot of my engagement became remote over COVID and actually became silent, in that I was researching and reading things, sometimes without even interaction with people. But then when I did move into the space of interacting with people and I worked through presenting the research and so on, I found, and I was deeply honored and moved by, first of all, the resonance between the places that I was working in. So for example, between the Tabernacle and New Beacon Books, and the many other places in the research. When I first presented the research to Matthew, who runs the Notting Hill Carnival and the Tabernacle, he recognized by name many of the people who were in the photographs that I was showing, and he knew them personally. And for me, that was a kind of real, I don't know, I felt really excited by that, but also I think it somehow showed a commitment on both parties, that there's an understanding of the depth that I was trying to reach. And I don't know that I did reach it, but the research trajectory at least did find resonance in these different places. Another, for example, is Nadia from New Beacon Books. She's actually written a reflection piece on her own that I think is going to be published on the Serpentine website, if it isn't already, about her first meeting with the pavilion curator, Natalia, and some of their first discussions and how those have later evolved, and just her reflections, both on the collaboration that we had, but also her feelings when she spent time at the pavilion space itself. I think in terms of, I don't know that I use the word inclusion, and if it is used in articles and so on, it might be paraphrased, because I don't know, I've always found it a difficult word, because I believe in speaking powerfully from places of difference, and I don't believe in a kind of flatness or homogeneity, but really in thinking through the vibrancy of having different voices and the conversation that different voices on a shared platform, not a common ground where things are flattened, but in allowing different voices to be their full different selves, and in the bringing together of those to generate interesting conversations. And so for me, that was something I really wanted to do in this pavilion, is have it be a place for the coming together of lots of different bodies of knowledge and lots of different realms, both in terms of different places and different institutions in London, but also different disciplines, whether that is sound practice and design, or whether that is working with different age groups and bringing together different generations. That's something that I'm constantly thinking through as an act of design, is how can we also start to facilitate conversation across different realms. I think it's also not fair of me to answer in terms of the way that the pavilion functioned, in how it had an impact on different people and so on. I can definitely speak to the intents, but I think that perhaps we need to, I don't know, look at different bodies or to different voices to talk about the experience of the project. I didn't make it for myself.
Yeah, no, thank you very much also for your interpretation of the term inclusion. That is really interesting for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumayya. I have a last question before also passing the ground for making questions to the master students that are following your conversation, our conversation. Because you're also a teacher, I was wondering if you could say something more about how you bring that energy into your pedagogical practices. Thank you.
Which energy?
Before you were talking about how Counterspace came as a result of you being students, bringing kind of the energy as a reaction to what you were receiving as an education as well in architecture. Yes. So how then, now that you're a teacher, how you teach and what you do as a teacher towards students?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just also had one last reflection on the previous question about different realms, perhaps also of resource and the space of the Serpentine Gallery itself. I think there's, of course, the Serpentine is a public institution and ticketing is free and it is therefore a publicly accessible space. And yes, we can talk about the project of museums and galleries and who feels welcome in spaces and why. The Serpentine also does have a commitment to an ongoing emerging civic practice and project, and Amal Khalaf's been leading that for the last 10 years. But that aside, I think more generally and more broadly, if we think of platforms of visibility and resource, there's something I think to be at least I think in practice terms, I often think about how to bring these different realms together and what we gain or what we give by working through certain conditions and in certain contexts like Johannesburg, but then working with those conditions through a place like London or through a platform like the Serpentine. I think we can also work to give visibility and to be generative and to use these platforms of resource to further our research projects and in turn then bring back to the different spaces that we inhabit in our other realms. So I think there's always a tension somehow in working across platforms of where we are resourced differently or where we are abled or enabled differently. But I believe in being able to use and work with these platforms as much as we can to be as generative as possible. But it is something that is tricky and has to be negotiated all the time. And then on the question of teaching, pedagogy, and perhaps, let's say, responses to practice and canon, I think for me, the ambition and interest of Counterspace are reflected in my teaching practice, but perhaps the teaching studio is a space of kind of slower, perhaps much more speculative research. And I think that there's always an exchange and there's always a dialogue between these different speeds and these different realms. And I certainly see the pedagogical space as very important in slowly brewing these difficult questions that we're grappling with. The practice space perhaps is a space where some of these questions have to be responded to in a more instant fashion or, through the bold making of an intervention, an installation, sometimes a building or a film. But I think that there's a kind of real-time, real constraints translation that happens in the practice, and that is in constant dialogue with the slow research that is happening on the pedagogical level. But I think it's, for me, absolutely important to have the slow place of pedagogical research, because otherwise we get trapped by just constantly having to quote unquote solve difficult questions that we have in our present conditions. And continuously having this slow space of research is really important because it's a place to be able to deeply grapple with longer term, what I call the deep social project of not having to just answer and provide to questions of service delivery, but where we can really think through the much deeper project of forms of manifestation of different worlds and different imaginations that will somehow trickle down into practice at different levels. It's the same kind of questions of hybrid identity and territory that the practice is concerned with are the same questions that come through in the pedagogical intent. And in my teaching studio, I often work with students to bring about different forms of architectural projects and representations that are about something through their own individual lens. Their forms of hybrid identity, and we use lots of different identifiers, gender, cultural heritage, forms of ethnicity, and different cultural conditions.
Thank you very much, Sumayya. Now I invite the students, if you have questions, to please make them to Sumayya. I don't know if you are online or live, so please give a sign.
Hello, I am online, so I can ask a question.
Yes, hi.
Okay, hello. First, thank you so much for your work. You're really an inspiration, at least for me, and I think everyone else. And you have done really a lot for a very young age. So my question is, the pavilion is a temporary structure, and it is really, I really appreciate the use of the recycled material. And the pavilion design was based on the past and the present for gathering places. So do you believe we have to focus on the past to plan for the future? And what is the future for the pavilion, since it's like, let's say, a temporary structure?
Yes, thank you. I think that the past is somehow always present because we're living with the consequences of things that happened in the past all the time, whether it's our economic system, whether it's our conditions for how we think about everything, race and gender societal norms, even how we write history is still affecting our present conditions. So I think there's absolutely always an engagement with the past in every single project, and if somebody feels that they are not engaging with the past through their project, they are somehow, because they're then continuing in some kind of form of politics that already exists, or they're perpetuating a form of politics that conscious or subconscious or aware or unaware, architecture exists in the world, and so therefore it's always implicated in the conditions around us. So I think that the more of a conscious approach that we have towards this, hopefully the richer the conversation the project can bring. So I think it's absolutely something that's always there, whether we kind of state that overtly or not. It's always present. The past is always present. And then the future of the pavilion is every year it's acquired, and the funds from that acquisition go into building the next pavilion. So the sale of my pavilion was enabled by the build of my pavilion was enabled by the sale of Yunya's pavilion, and the sale of my pavilion is enabling the build of the Asta's pavilion. But it's been sold to Term Art, and I am working on another project with them at the moment for a garden and a center in honor of the Pan-African Conference that happened in Manchester. And so I hope that through this dialogue that I'm able to also be a part of the conversation about the next life of the pavilion. And I really do hope that it is able to have a very public life in its next phase, but it's still to be seen.
Thank you so much for the answer.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Maybe?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question. This is something you touched briefly when you were talking about color and color in your practice. We were like fascinated by the lexicon you are building, and in particularly by the concept of afterglow, as in like beauty often created by workers and resources that are not often associated with the production of something beautiful. Like we saw the For the Skies project and the sunset of Johannesburg. So we wanted to ask you, this afterglow seems to return frequently in your practice. So how much this vision of color and like afterglow guide your architectural practice, and how much do you think this concept can be an effective synthesis of architectural practice in a multicultural society? Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I understand the question. Thank you for the beautiful question. I think this idea of afterglow is very interesting. It's on a physical level or on a atmospheric level, absolutely talking about this condition of something that is a kind of remnant of the afterlife of something that happened before. And just touching on the previous question, I think it's also about this interest in realizing that the past is always present and it's always here in the form of the afterglow, perhaps, whether that is materially beautiful or difficult, or both, as the example that you just mentioned. So I think that that's definitely a term that I'm interested in, and thinking about that as a condition is somehow very important for me. Can you remind me the other parts of the question? Sorry.
You already kind of answered that, but we wanted to ask you how much this concept of afterglow like guides your architectural practice, and we were wondering if maybe this concept of afterglow, as you use it, maybe an effective synthesis for the architectural practice in a multicultural world as it is right now, the world in which we are practicing architecture.
Yeah, I think so in many ways, on the one hand, there is this idea of the afterglow in the abstract, and that the idea that the past is always present. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. But then there's something else about on a phenomenon scale, let's say, where and the folded skies is an example of that. The physical translation of something that's atmospheric and intangible is also something that I'm interested in, and maybe that's an example of a physical installation that was actually made that is about afterglow, but it's the encapsulation of an idea of working through methodologies like that work to heighten awareness of a condition of the past that is still present, but also work through the translation of atmospheric phenomenon and of things that are not quite translated in physical terms yet, but have the potential to contribute something to the making of architecture. I feel like that's an abstract answer, but I guess I'm saying that I agree. I think that this idea of afterglow, perhaps in many different scales and in many realms, is an interesting one to think about in practice.
Thank you very much. It was an abstract question to start with, but thank
lovely
you.
question. Thank you.
I wonder if there's one last question. We might just have time to squeeze that in. Otherwise, I'll start some final comments. One last.
Hi, Sumayya. Recipes and foods and sharing meals as a community seems to be a recurring thread in your research practice. So, I see this conference is happening at lunchtime, at least in Italy. We want to ask you if we are all sitting around at the same table for lunch, what you propose we all eat on the place from your Sunday race ritual. And if we intend sitting at a table as a metaphor for a meeting happening in a multicultural society, would you propose a recipe that represent us all, a synthesis, or would you elaborate it more like an encounter? Thank you.
Thank you. I love the question. I don't know if I'm able to answer what everyone should be eating, but I'm very interested in recipes as maps for the ways in which people have moved and the ways in which cultures have been shared. I'm really also interested in them as media for holding hybridity. There's a really interesting project that actually Amal did at the Serpentine, where she worked with eggplant as an ingredient on the Edgware Road and looked at many different recipes that different cultures have for the same ingredient on the street, which is very multicultural. And I think that that's something that's interesting about the coming together on a shared surface or a shared platform, is that there are ways to highlight the power of difference and highlight the aspects of difference, but also celebrate the resonance between different bodies of knowledge and different times in history, different forms of culture and different forms of cultural practice. And that's something that I think we have around the shared table. So that's a really beautiful metaphor, and I hope you are all having lunch together at a shared table.
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, we're long overdue for lunch together, all of us, including you. I'm just going to take the last couple of minutes to perhaps speak back to your incredibly generous thoughts and way of sharing them. And I think perhaps one way that I have to reflect on them is the difficulty of fixing definitions. And I think that this is really, I think, an important reminder of the uncertainty within which we live, and the need to almost resist classifications, right? As a tactic to imagine a future which is different from the present. And I think that's I mean, also in this constant in between that you describe, the slower pace of the studio versus the faster pace of the practice, the question of the hybridity of the identities that speak, for instance, to diaspora that you haven't brought up in today's conversation, but we understand is there in the different forms of space and placemaking that are not one the fact that the language is plural by its own nature and needs to be constantly learned and inhabited rather than being permanently fixed, instills doubt in what we do, which I think is, again, the uncertainty and the fluidity of your approach, and that I think is a reminder of the fact that we need the ungrounding, right? So that the ground is there, but under the ground there might be holes. And your earlier descriptions of the mines under Johannesburg, I think, are a powerful reminder of that. And so the fact that one needs that to be mindful that the fact that the ground might just collapse, and as the Zama miners do, they take a chance, they try their luck. So I really want to bring this all together, because it offers us the space to imagine rather the certainty of knowing what we're doing, which I think is a productive thought. And in that, it brings to a close the seminar, my visiting professorship. I want to thank you, Sumayya, for being here today, Maxwell for having been here before, Saskia, Ludovica, Sanchi, Francisco, Julia, Monica, the two Ricardos for taking part in the PhD seminar, Camillo, who has already left, but that's his way, and all the other students who are here in the room for making this happen. It's been an incredible gift, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, Sumayya.
Thank you so much for the gift of this invitation and those beautiful, generous words. I hope I'm able to somehow embody them. Thank you.